Welcome back, AP Psychers. In today's video, we are going to overview the second research method, FRQ, that was assigned over April break. The very first question is, why can we conclude a cause and effect relationship based on this prompt? Well, there are a couple things that you could cite in order to answer this. The first is that the prompt clearly states that random assignment was used. This question is a variation of a question that we've seen a few other times throughout the year. That question has been presented in the past, usually is presented as what makes this an experiment rather than correlational research. And one of the appropriate answers to that question has been the use of random assignment. This is a similar way of asking that same question. So why can we conclude a cause and effect relationship? Well, the prompt clearly states that random assignment was used. That would be an appropriate answer. So in one sentence, the researchers can conclude cause and effect because random assignment was used. This was also an experiment with manipulation. The use of manipulation in the context of a controlled experiment like this is another definitive reason why we can state a cause and effect relationship. These are really the only appropriate answers for this problem. All right, the second bullet asks, assuming all mean differences are significant, was there an effect in the context of this study? So just very briefly, this was a study as to whether or not exposure to certain types of television have differing effects on your emotion. What would happen if you saw good TV, bad TV, funny TV, and then if you saw no TV whatsoever? I've recreated the visual that was provided for you, the bar graphs. The green are pre-test evaluations. The red are post-test evaluations. And these markers are clear visuals of whatever the emotional effects happen to be. So I would assume, although it wasn't explicitly stated in this study, that the researchers came up with some type of maybe 1 to 10 scale that the participants filled out that evaluated their own personal emotions, and were asked to use a pre-test and post-test in order to see whether or not there was a change. So if we take a look here, the good column, the pre-test actually went down, so there was some type of an emotional effect that caused this to go down, potentially. The bad TV caused an increase, the funny TV caused a decrease, and then the control saw no difference. That's what I'm trying to indicate here all the way to the right. The phrase in the prompt, assuming all mean differences are significant, is a reference to a concept that we described as statistical significance, which would mean that this being true determines that you did prove cause and effect. So what this prompt is telling you, when it has a phrase, assuming all mean differences are significant, that is directly telling you that this experiment actually did show cause and effect. The results were not dumb luck and the results were not a fluke. What's a little bit more unique about this question is it's asking you to actually pull from the graphs themselves to determine exactly what that cause and effect relationship happens to be. What seems to happen here is that bad TV did cause a change in the dependent variable, which in this study was emotion. You could use the columns here to make that definitive statement. You could also flip this around. Instead of saying bad TV did cause a change, you could even specify bad TV caused an increase. You could also say positive TV, whether that's the good news or the funny news, did cause a change in the dependent variable, because you would notice that both of the red columns under the good and funny categories did in fact decrease. What this prompt was basically asking you to do was to draw the conclusion that could be made from using these bar graphs. And the obvious conclusions here is that bad news did in fact change emotion level, so an increase in whatever the evaluation of emotion happened to be, while the good and funny news saw a decrease, as you can clearly see indicated there. The reason we can actually throw around the word cause, as I wrote here in the prompt, is that it has assuming all mean differences are significant. That has a very specific meaning in research methods. That means the experiment and the results of the experiment did in fact prove a cause and effect relationship, which we can definitively state. The third bullet is one I think you could very easily see on the AP exam, where it picks a brain region and asks how it relates to a study. So you do in fact need to know the study's context, but also what the brain region does. In this prompt, it asked you about the amygdala. The function of the amygdala, if you were to go back and look at the Prezi in Unit 5, I think 5.5a, the amygdala is responsible for emotion. It plays a vital role in the fear response, which is the fight or flight response, and amongst many other aspects of our nervous system. But the amygdala's simple function, if you were really to boil it down, is emotion, which means in the context of this study, when we measure emotion, we very easily could just measure activity in the amygdala. So, for example, we could measure overall activity of the amygdala when determining if someone is scared, which is really precisely what this study was doing. Would you feel some type of emotional response when you were exposed to bad news? One simple negative response that you could articulate could be fear. The amygdala would be a great way of doing so. You would measure whether or not the amygdala was going crazy while watching that, which is clearly a connection back to its primary function and a great connection back to the context of the study. The fourth bullet is another one that I think is really great to practice because it's a little bit different. It identifies a psychologist and asks you to apply their research to a setting. Ekman was a recent name back from Unit 8 when we were talking about emotion. That was one of the units that we've had to do outside of class entirely. If you remember back in Essential Task 8.4 at the very end of the Unit 8 Essential Tasks, Paul Ekman had a few different contributions. The big contribution were the 6 universal facial expressions. I asked you to previously write an FRQ about Ekman, so hopefully that practice and the feedback that I gave you then benefited you now. But Ekman back in Unit 8 determined that there were 6 universal facial expressions that everybody expresses. So whether you're happy, whether you're sad, disgust, fear, etc. Even if you're blind and have never seen another human face, those facial expressions are innate. So people will express disgust when they are disgusted, no matter what. Which means in the context of this study, yes. The answer to this is a definitive yes. The researchers would be able to recognize facial expression. For example, people who are experiencing fear are going to demonstrate the fear facial expression across the board. So in this study that's measuring emotional response, if fear is a component of the emotional response, participants are going to universally express the exact same facial expression, which would be easy to identify for the researchers. The fifth bullet would have been a really challenging one if I didn't provide you the hint about the Big Five. McCrae and Coster were the 2 psychologists back in Unit 4 who were responsible with identifying the Big Five traits of personality, which is the most popular form of personality trait testing out there. The Big Five, as we talked about back in Unit 4, are comprised of conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion, or extroverted. The prompt was basically asking which of these personality traits most clearly connects with the dependent variable in the study, which in the context of this study was an evaluation of emotional response. So which of these personality traits most clearly connect with emotional response? Conscientiousness has to do with organization and discipline. Do you keep a well-connected or well-rounded schedule? Do you do your homework on time? Is your room organized, your backpack organized, your binder, etc.? Agreeableness is really an evaluation of how easy you are to work with other individuals. Are you easy to connect with? Are you easy to work with at school, at work? Or are you an individual who takes a lot of initiative and really needs to be the leader, who might not necessarily respond well to the opinions of others under all circumstances? Neuroticism is how well you deal with your emotions, really. Are you stress prone? Are you a little bit more relaxed in general? Openness is the way we described how you open to new ideas, whether that's culinary things, whether that's taking new classes, trying a new sport, whatever it might be. And then extroverted is an evaluation of whether or not you like social settings where there's a lot of people. Do you like social settings where there's very few people? Are you seeking the attention of others, or are you more sort of to yourself? Of those 5 options, neuroticism, I think, is the clearest personality trait that's connected to emotion. Neuroticism really is an evaluation of your ability to sort of maintain your emotion, or to the extent in which your emotion can shift depending on what's going on around you. If you didn't directly state neuroticism, it's not inconceivable that you use the words like anxiety or some of the synonyms, but it really would have been ideal for you to go straight to neuroticism. I understand this bullet could be challenging because it would require you to remember names that we did not emphasize back in Unit 4. I totally admit I did not stress these two names. I'm going to try and provide you with a list of psychologist names leading into the AP exam, so that if you were to see a question like this, you would very easily be able to track down their contribution, and assuming you know or studied their contribution, you could very easily answer that FRQ without having to memorize a list of 70 different names. Usually find a question like this in the multiple choice every year that points to a region of the brain it asks you to identify the function. It's not impossible that you see that in an FRQ. It could easily be done, so don't be surprised by seeing a diagram like this. It's not inconceivable, although it's not something we've done before. In this question, it pointed to the lobe in the back of your head. So very briefly, I'm just going to go over the 4 lobes. The frontal lobe is here, the one that's in the front. Your temporal lobe is where your Dre beats would be located, responsible for auditory processing. Your parietal lobe here is in the back of your head, which leaves the final lobe as the occipital lobe, which is responsible for visual processing. The question then asked, what would your occipital lobe be doing during the study? Well, if you're watching TV, your occipital lobe is going to be responsible for processing what you see. So it's a very simple question. Your occipital lobe would be going crazy processing what it is that you see on the television. This is not what the prompt asked, but it's not inconceivable that they do a similar question and then instead they shade the temporal lobe. And if that was the question, you would simply say, your temporal lobe is responsible for processing what you hear on the news. So it's a very simple question, simply asking you to identify the function and what that function would be doing in the context of the study, which here would be simply processing what you see on the television.